Aristotle referred to the myths as an ancient treasure. Sadly, we're ignoring this precious inheritance. It's been deliberately devalued by people who don't want you to know anything about this ancient treasure, which was in remote antiquity given to every culture on the planet as their sacred traditions. Do the myths have anything to say about economics? Of course they do. They contain wisdom that applies to all areas of life, and they address economic issues directly. The myths of ancient Greece, for example, teach that the gift of wine is given by the god Dionysus. The gifts of grain and the produce of the land are given by the goddess Demeter. The ancient philosopher Plutarch asserts this principle in one of his letters where he writes, "Why slander the earth by implying that she cannot support you? Why impiously offend law-giving Demeter and bring shame upon Dionysus, Lord of the cultivated vine, the gracious one, as if you did not receive enough from their hands? Certain gifts belong in the public domain for the good of all the people. Those who try to take those too for their own private benefit in order to amass even more wealth are, to borrow Plutarch's argument, slandering the earth, slandering nature, impiously offending the law-giving gods, the gracious benefactors of humanity, by trying to take those gifts too, as if they didn't receive enough from their hands." The olive tree was specifically understood to be a gift given by the goddess Athena to the people. The riches under the earth, including all mineral wealth, was understood to belong to the god of the underworld, whose name was usually not mentioned, and so he was referred to as the wealthy one, or Pluton. And the most important gift given to any nation is the people of that nation, who are specifically understood to have been allowed to have been born into that nation by the gods, specifically by the goddess Artemis in the myths of ancient Greece. Artemis, who's said to be present at the birth of every child and to allow that birth to take place. And the gifts given to every man and woman are also specifically understood to have been given by the gods. This fact is also made clear in numerous ancient myths. So robbing the gifts given by the gods is actually a form of stealing from the gods and collaborating against the gods. And that includes robbing the people of the resources that are given to them, especially the gifts that are given them, the ability to use their gifts given to them by the divine realm, which means that forcing unemployment and underemployment is also a form of stealing from the gods, because it prevents people from using the gifts that were given to them from heaven, and thus wastes the gifts of the gods. In ancient society saw one of the primary jobs of the rulers, or the ruler, to be the protection of the resources which the gods gave to all the land and to all the people that the gods allowed to be born into that land. Protection from oligarchs who wanted to take those resources for themselves, which today we would call privatizing those resources, privatizing what is public, privatizing the public domain. The word private has the same root as the word deprive. It means to fence something off from others so that it's only yours. In order to make even more profits, like Plutarch said, they didn't feel like they received enough from the gods, so they have to privatize the resources of the public domain for themselves. And they want to smash down the ancient role of governments to protect those resources, because one of the easiest ways to make huge amounts of money is to take over what was given for the good of the people, what belongs to the public domain, and privatize it so that essentially you can charge private tax on it, as we will see. One of the most important economists you can listen to and read is Professor Michael Hudson. And in a recent interview on radical imagination, he said,
And that's why modern religion is the opposite of the religion that I describe in the Bronze Age. In the Bronze Age, the rulers took a pledge upon taking the throne. They pledged to the gods to cancel the debts, redistribute, take the land that had forfeited and give it back to the defaulting debtors and reestablish order. So that was the idea of religion back then. Now religion has become a self-serving handmaiden of the wealth to justify their theft of the public domain and their privilege to make people pay for education, health care, land, basic things that should be the public right.
Which is what...
Note very carefully what Professor Hudson just said. The rulers had a duty to the gods to give back what had been sold off because of debt and to reestablish order. That was the ancient understanding. But somewhere along the line, the ancient wisdom given to all cultures in the form of ancient myth got inverted. And now, this is exactly how Professor Hudson phrases it, religion has become the handmaiden of theft. I'll tell you where I think it got inverted, and this is me talking, not Michael Hudson, and that was with the imposition of literalist Christianity. I make a distinction between the ancient stories and scriptures of the Bible and the system of literalist Christianity, which according to my analysis actually turns the message of those scriptures and of those stories on their head by literalizing them. The stories in the Bible can be proven to be based on the very same system of celestial metaphor that forms the foundation for virtually all the other myths of cultures around the world. And I've written a 766-page book detailing the connection between the stars and the heavenly cycles and the figures and events described in the Bible. And that book, even though it's 766 pages, it's just scratching the surface of the connections that could be shown. The creation of literalist Christianity, which took place during the Roman Empire, turns the ancient meaning of the ancient myths on their heads in all kinds of ways. And I would argue that it has pretty much literalist Christianity, that is, literalism has pretty much always been the handmaiden of theft, in that it wants to destroy the ancient vision of the role of government as protecting the public domain, answerable to the gods who gave those gifts to the people and to the nation and to the land, and wants to give away the public domain to oligarchs. And literalist Christianity has a long history of doing that. In fact, not long after the Emperor Constantine declared Christianity to be the official religion of the Roman Empire, and that declaration was the culmination of a long campaign to get rid of the old gods and the old myths. Why? In order to get rid of, this is me talking again, in order to get rid of the understanding taught in those original traditions given to the various cultures, the ancient tradition about the gifts of the gods. Literalist Christianity in its current form was nobody's original sacred tradition. If your ancestors practiced literalist Christianity, their ancestors at some point did not. They converted to it at some point, or more likely they were forced to convert to it. It's not an original sacred tradition, at least not in its original form. It does have some indication that it's related to the ancient myths of Egypt, for instance, those sacred traditions. But it's a new version of that, especially in its literalist form. And it was designed to overthrow the original sacred traditions of the world. And its practitioners have been hard at work on that mission for the past 17 centuries. And they're still hard at work at that today. They're quite open about it. This isn't an accusation that I just dreamed up. They themselves declare that this is their mission. Anyway, it's very significant to point out that not long after Constantine, the Roman Empire was divided into East and West by one of his successors a generation or two after, not long after. And then the Western Empire was dissolved, and Western Europe became an oligarchy, in which warlords would have their own private fiefdoms, and there was no public domain, and basically all of the wealth that was poured out by nature would be coughed up to the oligarchs, while the people were allowed just what was necessary for bare survival at subsistence levels of survival. And this arrangement was held in place both by the threat of violence, but also by the literalist Christian church, which taught that it was God's will and that resisting the teachings of the church would result in eternal torment in hellfire. So we see literalist Christianity acting as the handmaiden of, first, the end of the worship of the gods, and that ancient understanding given in the ancient wisdom that's preserved by the various cultures around the world that Professor Hudson just talked about. And then acting as the handmaiden for the dissolution of the Roman state, which happened not long after Christianity was declared to be the official religion of the state. Then they split it in half, and then they started dissolving it to get rid of the state, which enabled the rise of oligarchy and feudalism in Western Europe. And then we also see literalist Christianity acting as a handmaiden to help maintain that system using the threat of hellfire right up to the beginning of the modern period. Feudalism is pretty much the original definition of austerity. Take away the public domain and give it to oligarchs and tax the people and reduce public spending basically to zero, and if possible dissolve all central government altogether in order to give feudal oligarchs no obstacles to what they can do and how much they can gouge the people. The central point to notice is the privatization, the monopolization in private hands of the gifts given to the nation, the gifts of nature, the natural resources, the gifts given to the people. And how do we see this same privatization of the public sphere happening today? Well, we see it when governments sell off more and more of the public domain to private equity, and private investors, billionaire foundations, and private corporations. Greece, the country of Greece, their government was recently forced to sell off the port of Piraeus to a foreign corporation. That's the ancient port of Piraeus that you read about in your ancient history of Athens. It's now been sold off to a corporation. Majority ownership is now owned by a corporation. The government of Greece has also now sold off and thus privatized their train system, their public water company, and 14 regional airports, plus another port. And that happened in 2017, which means it had nothing to do with the current virus situation. When you own the water system, when you're able to buy the water system as a private player, guess what? You get to charge a private tax, getting yourself into a position where the government allows you as a private individual or a private equity investor or a corporation or a foundation or a private owner to charge a private tax on the people who need to use that resource, and to charge it year in and year out, such as through ownership of the water system, or ownership of a toll road, or ownership of some other monopoly privilege. That's how you become a billionaire. That's how you amass tremendous amounts of wealth. Most enormous amounts of wealth can be tied back to that pattern in some way. There are certain roads in Southern California, for instance, where you have to pay tolls, and those tolls, they don't go to the state of California. They don't go to the municipality. Maybe part of them do. But they go to some private company. It's a form of private taxation. There's parking meters on city streets in the U.S. today that are owned by private equity investment firms. Entire city blocks where the government has sold off the privilege of putting parking meters and charging a parking fee, which is essentially a tax, to private equity firms to basically charge a private tax. Remember what Michael Hudson said about the ancient rulers in the ancient world who swore an oath to the gods when they took office to restore order by giving back what had been taken by creditors, to protect what was given by the gods to the people, what modern economists call the public domain. Now the elected representatives are doing the opposite. Instead of protecting the public domain for the benefit of the people, like in ancient times they had to swear to the gods to do that, now instead they're selling it off to their friends and family relations and big political donors and Wall Street cronies and corporate cronies to be able to charge a private tax on it. There are enough ways to increase wealth by adding value through industry and innovation and hard work. But as Plutarch says, some people feel the need to insult the gods as if they're not given enough from their hands already, and start taking and insulting the gods and taking the gifts that they give to the whole nation. And even from those who will be born in future generations. That is stealing from the nation and stealing from heaven. So how do they get away with this? Well, as Michael Hudson explains, modern religion is the handmaiden of theft. And there's actually a religious aspect to the trick that they use most often to steal the public domain and sell it off to their cronies. The formal name in economic terms for this favorite trick is austerity. Austerity, which almost has a religious ring to it already. And the full name of the economic term is fiscal austerity, because it has to do with taking away the power of fiscal policy from the people and from governments, from their elected representatives if it's a democratic government. The crisis that we're going through right now is accelerating the imposition of austerity upon the people. But the thing that needs to be widely understood is that austerity has been on the agenda, being deliberately imposed for decades. This crisis, whether it's a natural disaster or a man-made disaster, is being used to accelerate the imposition of austerity. And if it is a man-made disaster, as some are alleging, then my guess is that it was not made by China. Because first of all, China is not pursuing a policy of austerity. Second, we have the very suspicious fact that in October of 2019, Johns Hopkins University, in conjunction with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and certain elements of the American intelligence community, ran a simulation about the economic and societal impact of a coronavirus, which is a pretty amazing coincidence, and one that I don't think the government of China would have been able to orchestrate at Johns Hopkins University. Third, you might remember that the rulers of Iran were hit by the disease almost simultaneously, their entire legislature and parliament, right after China was hit. So if you think there's a bioweapon, which by the way is illegal to create, illegal to even research, and especially illegal to release upon a population. So if it's a bioweapon, then whoever's behind it can be called criminal. If it's actually a bioweapon and you had to bet on whether it was created by criminals in the US or criminals in China, knowing that it was first released in China and then Iran, which one would you guess to be more likely to want to wipe out the leadership of Iran? Criminals in the US or in China? So whether or not there's a natural disaster or a man-made disaster, this disaster is likely going to be used to accelerate austerity, which means fiscal austerity, which is a disaster for any nation that's forced to adopt it. An absolute disaster that's been unrolling for decades, not tied to the current crisis, but one which could easily be accelerated by the current crisis. So what is fiscal austerity, and why is it so important to understand? Fiscal austerity means taking away the power of elected governments to use fiscal policy. Fiscal policy means taxing and spending by governments. Fiscal policy means how much you tax and how much you spend. And fiscal austerity is a policy forcing governments to tax more and spend less in order to run balanced budgets or budget surpluses, no matter what the economic conditions. And there's actually a religious component to this issue, because there are people who view it as a moral issue or they try and pose it as a moral issue for governments to run a balanced budget or a surplus budget, taxing more than they spend, spending less than they bring in revenues, which is primarily taxes. It may be a moral issue for a family to run a balanced budget, but that does not mean that it is a moral issue for a government to run a balanced budget or a budget surplus. But it's very easy to trick people into taking that position. And it's a trick because what it actually ends up doing is creating more debt amongst the people, amongst the population, and also it ends up forcing governments to sell off the public domain, which is actually the goal of those who want to be able to privatize the public domain, imposing private taxes on the populace, and also by putting people into debt. So if you want more debt and you're in a position to benefit from the sell-off of public domain, as in you're able to buy it and then charge private taxes on it, then of course you're going to tell people, oh yeah, it's a moral issue. We need surpluses all the time, balanced budgets all the time at the very least, no deficits. And so once again, we see that Michael Hudson's quotation about modern religion being an absolute inversion of the ancient understanding and turning into the handmaiden of theft is at work here, and turning into the ancient kings had to give back land that had been taken by creditors and cancel the debts. And this is actually putting people into more debt. Fiscal policy is taxing and spending, and it's tremendously powerful. If you've got the power to tax, for example, and you don't want foreign corporations taking all your natural resources for their own benefit without any benefit going to the people of your nation, to whom nature or the gods gave that natural resource, let's say it's oil or copper or some other gift, then you can impose a tax on the oil or the copper or whatever it is that they take out of the ground, so that whatever value they take out of the natural resources, part of that is given to the nation. Those resources were given to the nation. When they pull it out, the tax takes part of that, part of the value of whatever they're pulling out of the ground of your country. And you can, if you got fiscal policy, you can tax that at whatever rate the elected representatives of the nation decide. And if you've got the power to spend, then you can create public schooling so that boys and girls and men and women can, public universities can, they have various talents and gifts, so they can go and pursue their dreams and use those gifts that they were given out in the world. They can learn how to become better musicians or better engineers or better teachers or better farmers or whatever. Those are all things that you can do with the power to tax and spend, plus a million other things. Obviously, it's an extremely, extremely important power. So fiscal policy is enormously powerful, and it's usually contrasted with monetary policy. Monetary policy has to do with interest rate changes by central banks. In the US, the Fed is the central bank. And it mostly has to do with banks and lending and liquidity, interest rates, the monetary system. It's important, but it's nowhere near as powerful as fiscal policy. The reason you hear so much about the Fed and you never hear anything about fiscal policy is nobody wants you to know how powerful fiscal policy is. In fact, they don't even want you to know what it is. It's pretty simple to understand, but they don't want you to know about it as the most powerful tool that elected governments or any nation has at their disposal. So there's been a concerted campaign to take fiscal policy away as a tool of the people and of democratic governance. So all we hear about anymore is monetary policy. If you take away fiscal power, what happens is the people fall into greater and greater debt because nations are artificially forced to spend less. And when they're spending less than they're taxing, what are they doing? They're sucking money out of the system. This is not a controversial or arguable point. If you spend less than you tax, you're pulling money out of the system. And you're going to end up impoverishing the system. People are going to have to go into debt in order to buy things. And you're also, if you're artificially made to run a balanced budget or even a surplus, or if you're artificially limited to a very small deficit, like in many of the European nations, they can never go more than 3% into a deficit, then you're going to have to tax more. You're either going to have to tax more to get more revenues, or you're going to have to start selling off the public domain to private parties, such as corporations and private equity and foreign investors and wealthy family trusts and billionaires, in order to raise revenues to get your balanced budget. So people say, sorry, you're trying to spend more than you're bringing in, and so you need to sell something off to bring in a little bit more if you want to try and do that spending. And so that means what ends up happening is the ports and the roads and the water services and the airports and the communications infrastructure and other aspects of the national infrastructure get privatized, sold off by politicians who are in league with the privatizers rather than doing their job of protecting the public domain that belongs to the nation and the people. And because the people in general don't understand fiscal policy, they don't even know the term fiscal policy, these politicians can get away with saying, we have to have a balanced budget. So if we want to spend more in order to meet this or that emergency, we're going to have to sell off more of the public domain. And people say, well, I guess that's right. We're going to have a balanced budget. I mean, it's a moral thing. In fact, I understand that. So that's how those two things are tied together. Fiscal policy is taxing and spending, and the relationship between those two determines the surplus or the deficit each year. But if you run a surplus, you're actually taking money out of the economy. If you keep taxing more than you spend, eventually you're going to tax all the money out of the economy. It's all going to get turned into the government. And if you do that, then people and businesses will go into more debt. It's simple math. And if you don't allow governments to spend without bringing in revenues, and that's when the politicians who are supposed to be acting for the good of all the people and for future generations start selling off the public domain and saying, see, we have to. It's an old trick, and it's been pushed in recent times since the 1970s and 1980s, but it's the same way that the religion of literalist Christianity was used to dissolve the Roman Empire and carve Europe up and give it away to what can basically be described as warlords or oligarchs. Either word is accurate. And reduce everyone else to serfdom and subsistence lifestyle. Austerity. It's the old austerity trick. There's absolutely no reason that governments cannot spend as much as is necessary to get through temporary crisis situations. And they can go into large deficits in order to do so. Here's a chart showing surpluses and deficits for the U.S. going back to the late 1920s. Notice that during World War II, the U.S. ran a deficit until the war was over. Look at how big that deficit was, over 26% of GDP. Nothing since that time has come close. World War II was fought from 1939 to 1945, of which the U.S. was involved from 1941 to 1945. And during that time, a huge percentage of the working age population was on the government payroll directly or indirectly, either serving in uniform or building things that the government bought in order to advance the war effort. We didn't, quote, run out of money, even though just about everybody in the workforce or in the military was being paid for everything that they ate, and all their housing and everything else was basically coming from the government. But we didn't run out of money. The Vietnam War was fought from 1964 to 1975. That's 11 or 12 years. And the U.S. didn't run out of money. So we could definitely take care of a month or a 2-month or a 3-month or even a year-long shutdown if we had to. I don't think anybody thinks it's going to take that. The government can absolutely afford to run a deficit as deep as they want to, as deep as is necessary in order to address a crisis. And Professor Michael Hudson explains that, guess what? They had crises in ancient times. In ancient times, debts would be canceled whenever a new king came to power in ancient times. In ancient Mesopotamia, the king would declare a complete debt forgiveness for personal debt. Not for business debt, but for personal debt. Additionally, if there was a year when the crops failed, or when military conflict destroyed the harvest or made it so that people couldn't get their ordinary income, they couldn't go out into the fields, the king would declare a debt forgiveness in that year as well. He points out that we have records showing that Hammurabi, king of Babylon, from 1792 BC to 1750 BC, canceled debts for everybody 4 times during his reign due to these kinds of situations. If you wanted to do that today, you could have the national government purchase the debts from the private holders of those assets and then cancel whatever debts it decided to cancel in order to help people through the crisis. There are all sorts of things that can be done in order to help individuals get through this situation, just as in ancient times they were done in order to get through a year in which the crops failed, for example. Michael Hudson points out that these kinds of provisions are included in the ancient scriptures of the Bible as well. We see the proclamation of the Jubilee year instituted in the Old Testament scriptures. That was a cancellation of debts and a return of any land that had been taken over by creditors back to the original families, back to the original owners. And there are a number of things that can be done in this current situation, but you're not going to see those things being done if you have both parties in most Western countries pushing austerity, which means pushing higher taxes and lower spending, which pretty much describes the two parties in the U.S. and most other Western countries. In the U.S., we have the higher taxes party competing with the lower spending party. So we got the two halves of the austerity to see who wins. It's just going to keep getting worse until the people wake up to the situation and demand a stop to it. But because when people don't understand the problem, they don't know how to stop it. And they go off in all kinds of mistaken directions, especially the badly mistaken libertarian direction. What we have going on is the selling off of the public domain to private interests, such as corporations and private equity. And what libertarians want to do is give everything to private interests. They want to get rid of the public sphere altogether. They just want everything to be private. They just don't want any public. Well, that's a trap. Libertarians think that if everyone just builds a nice off-the-grid sustainable farm in their backyard, all these problems will just wash over everyone else and leave the libertarians alone. Guess what? If you think that'll work, you're wrong. It's like in The Lord of the Rings, when darkness is creeping over the land, wanting to just go back to the Shire and ignore the threat and think it'll just impact everyone else.
Maybe Treebier's right. We don't belong here, Mary. It's too big for us. What can we do in the end? We've got the Shire. Maybe we should go.
Fires of Isengard will spread, and the woods of Tutbro and Buckland will burn, and all that was once green and good in this world will be gone. There won't be a Shire, Pippin.
This rot that's covering the land. Guess what? Unless you actually figure out how to take away the power of that rot that's trying to take over everything, then pretty soon there isn't going to be any Shire, Pippin. One of the ways to take away the power, you got to take away the power that's generating this engine of destruction. And the way to take away the power of privatizing things that belong to the people is for the people to realize that the politicians have no right to sell off or give away the public domain. In fact, they have a duty to prevent the selling off of the public domain and to rectify it, to correct it wherever it has already happened, to bring it back to a balance, to right it. Governments representing the people actually have no right to sell off what belongs to the people. As any government is actually supposed to be representing the people. It doesn't matter if it's a democracy or not. But governments do not have a right to sell off what belongs to the people. That is the public domain. So anyone who's doing that, which includes just about all of them in most Western democracies today, or oligarchies, are acting wrongly. They're selling something that doesn't belong to them to sell, which is criminal. And that means that anything that they sold off is actually wrongfully sold off and should be forced to be given back. If I buy a computer or a phone or a stereo or something, and it later turns out that it was stolen property, guess what? I have to give it back. I can't say, but I got a really good deal on it. I don't have to give it back. I got a really great deal on it. Sorry, you have to give it back because whoever sold it to you had no right to sell it to you. It's stolen property. It wasn't rightfully theirs to sell. Well, the same thing with the public domain. If some politician allows it to be sold off, guess what? They have no right to do that. So whoever bought it should give it back to its rightful owners as soon as they find out that they didn't have the right to buy that. Okay, that's what you do in civilized society. If you buy something that was stolen, you say, "Oh, I'm sorry. I want it to get back to its rightful owners." It's equivalent to stolen property if it rightfully belongs to someone else. And if it rightfully belongs to the nation, the people of the nation, not to private interests, then it should be administered in the public interest, not for private profit. And that means that toll roads and parking meters and aquifers and municipal water systems and anything else that was sold off that belongs to the public domain, if you bought that property from someone who didn't actually have the right to sell it, the right thing to do is return it. And if you're a politician who isn't actually in league with criminals in the first place, then you have a duty to ensure that it's returned to its rightful owners, which is the nation itself. People need to wake up to these realities. They need to learn what fiscal austerity means and why it's so devastating to their lives and the broader economy, and realize this trend has been going on for a lot longer than just the past few weeks, and start demanding an end to fiscal austerity and demand that this crisis that we're in see a rollback of austerity instead of an increase in austerity. It's immoral, it's unjust, and it needs to end. We actually have an opportunity in this crisis to make a real choice. We can continue with the creeping austerity and privatization that's impoverished the majority of the country, which can easily be accelerated by this situation, or we can wake up to how precarious people's economic lives have become, realize what's at the root of that problem, and start to repair the damage as fast as possible in a way that causes the least amount of harm as possible. But we can only do that if people actually wake up to what's going on, which people better start doing pretty quickly.